So gender and sex. Sex is a spectrum of things, right?
Is it?
Sex is a spectrum of things, right?
I would have to disagree with that.
Sex is your biological, we refer to sex as your biological assignment, right? So at birth,
You refer to it as biological assignment.
you were born male.
I refer to it as biological observation.
Well, see, that's tricky.
No, it's not, because that's another term that has become very popular.
Because we have
assignment.
these.
I wasn't assigned a sex at birth.
You were.
No, I wasn't.
No, they observed that you were
that I
male,
was male.
and they assigned you male. But here's where it gets tricky.
That's what that's.
I know it sounds simple, right? But there are some people who are born intersex.
Yes, a minuscule portion of society, but okay.
Right. Yeah. Intersex births always rank out at a minuscule proportion.
Always,
right?
which means
However,
they are an aberration.
So let's talk about this. Yeah, but they exist.
Yes, agreed.
Right? In 1990, the World Health Organization released a report that indicated that the Bahamas had the third highest prevalence of a condition called coadrenal hyperplasia related to fluoride, right? And I think it's fluorexide 21. Coadrenal hyperplasia.
We ain't had fluoride in the water that long.
Which may result in intersex births.
Okay,
right?
so they're not saying it absolutely is the cause.
But
they're saying we've seen some evidence to suggest.
Right, we have an abnormal rate of this condition in this area, and that condition may result in intersex births. There's documentation of abnormal intersex birth, rates of intersex birth in the Bahamas, in the Dominican Republic.
That I'm aware of.
And in Haiti, right? I think it's fair to say that we may have external factors like dumping of chemicals like fluoride.
I would completely agree.
In the water that has caused this abnormal increase in intersex births. But we know in this particular area, we have an increase from a minuscule to slightly less minuscule, right? So we're not talking about jumping to 1/3 of the births or 50% of the births, but we know that it's slightly higher in the Bahamas and in this region than in other places.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. We're talking about a small number of people being born intersex, very small. We say that the stats say that 4% of your society are going to be gay or lesbian, right? Like 4% is going to be strict gay or lesbian.
I heard it being slightly under 3%, but okay, I'll accept the 4.
Right, and I'll accept the slightly under 3 because we're talking about when these stats were compiled, we're talking about a severe lack of access to information. A lot of stats are still we're trying to gather stats from countries where homosexuality or buggery is still criminalized. And so de facto homosexuality is criminalized. So it's difficult conducting studies and collecting data.
I think it would be good to parenthetically just insert here that when you and I are talking, we are not talking about any moral judgments.
Yeah. Homosexuality in and of itself is not illegal in those countries, but buggery is illegal, right? So
for all intents and purposes, it's a reach around. There's a Freudian slip. It's a workaround to outlaw homosexuality.
Right. But we know that homosexuality in and of itself isn't just about sexual behavior, who you sleep with. It's about who you're attracted to. So you could be gay without ever actually engaging in same-sex intercourse.
Can you be straight while engaging in same-sex intercourse?
You can be. I think you can. So we have this category called circumstantial bisexuality.
Prisons and whatnot.
Right.
Okay.
Prisons and whatnot, where men engage in...
Desert islands.
Right. A number of people...
Locked in an elevator for 2 or 3 hours.
There are several arguments, right? Some people say, well, these men have always been on the scale of sexuality, they've always been bisexual. And this is a circumstance now where this is possible, right? Where they can engage in...
I don't know how that would be proven, but okay.
And this is the issue. A lot of these things are difficult to prove and to disprove, right? But we talk about sex work. There are men who identify as straight, who engage in same-sex sex work, right?
You gotta make...
So that's what they're saying, that they're not gay, but they do this work because they need the money. Some people argue that that means that you're bisexual, and you are attracted to, or you can be aroused by homosexual sex.
Well, I would be very willing to say that that is indeed a possibility, that as far as sex goes, or let's say bisexuality, homosexuality, it does depend. It has a lot to do with who one is attracted to, not necessarily the physical act that takes place.
Yeah.
We are
These-
agreeing entirely too much.
These issues are they're very complex, right? But they require, here's the thing, the process of personal development is a complex one, right? The process of discovering who you are, identifying who you are, is very complex, and it's very difficult for some people, right? It's important to allow people to identify how they want to identify. So I know people who I think are gay, like my spirit, like my chest starts to beat heavy.
Your gaydar.
Not like I'm attracted to them, and thus this is an attraction speaking, but I just get a heavy sense that you are a queer person. It's not my job to force that identity on you, though, right? My job is to create an environment in which you can make healthy choices about your life. I don't care whether you identify as gay or not. Here's what concerns me. I'm concerned that you are possibly a gay man that has identified as straight, that has married a woman, but is still engaging in sex with men. My concern isn't just that, but my concern is you may not be engaging in healthy sexual practices, right? That's where the concern should rise. We have to allow people to be who they are and to discover who they are, but create an environment in which they can make healthy decisions about their lives and the lives of the people they affect.
Now, how does all this relate to legislation? Because it's one thing to say, I acknowledge that you don't identify with the traditional line one way or the other. But as far as rights go,
Right.
or state-issued rights, depending on how you look at it, how do we deal with that?
Well, I think the state should take on the same position. It is not my job to tell you who you are or who you should be. My job as the state is through legislation and the application of resources to create an environment in which you can make healthy decisions and choices about yourself, and the healthy decisions and choices about your behavior that affects other people.
And what does that look like? I don't think that you're referring to something as anecdotal as just adding an extra classification on all legal documents.
Right. So what it means is that we need to have laws that say clearly, okay, for instance, we have the domestic violence laws, right? In 1991, the government created the Domestic Violence and Sexual Offenses Act.
Which I don't necessarily agree with, so very quickly I'll say why. If a crime has taken place, a crime has taken place. I don't believe that the extenuating circumstances of whether or not these two people were married should have anything to do with it.
Right. So in 1991, the Domestic Violence and Sexual Offenses Act, what it did was, it said that domestic violence could only take place between a husband and a wife. If the relationship was not a married relationship, then we don't regard this behavior as domestic violence.
So even if you and me dating,
Yeah.
we got an apartment together,
Yeah.
we've been living together for quite some time. If I punch you in your mouth or you cut me,
Neither
That's
of us
not
could.
domestic.
Well, in 1991, neither of us could apply for protection under that act because we weren't married, and that act specific to married people. In 2007, the government amended the domestic violence, I think part of the act, right? And it expanded the category of persons who could apply for protection, and it expanded the definition of violence, right? So now the act was no longer limited to a married couple in the household. Anybody in the household could apply for protection under the Domestic Violence Act. And witnesses from outside the household could call the police and say, hey, there is a domestic incident going on here. So the commissioner of police then could apply on behalf of a victim. right?
Do you see that as a victory?
Well, in and of itself is not a victory,
Okay.
right? Legislation in and of itself does not solve problems. There needs to be a complement of a cultural shift and social support for the laws.
Would you see the introduction of that legislation itself as being a victory or a step in the right direction?
A step in the right direction. I wouldn't call it a victory. We gotta get rid of this
Right.
this type of language.
But I have to stop you again,
Yeah.
though, because how would that be a step in the right direction if the laws should have already been? Let me put it like this. Why do we need domestic violence laws if it's already illegal for me to hit someone?
Because because we have cultures in this town that do not believe that every single person should be protected from violence by the law in every single
Agreed.
situation.
But did the law look at it that way prior to 1997?
I don't think so. I don't know.
This
we
is
don't,
what I'm saying.
Right, we don't have enough access to our lawmakers.
Agreed. But I don't see this as a step in the right direction. And let me explain this for you. If prior, did you say 1997 or 94? The domestic violence?
1991.
91, okay. In 1990, if I was married and my wife hit me over the head with a pan, I have an open gash in my head. I go to the police, I file a police report. Are you telling me that legally I couldn't do that, or just culturally the police would say, man, go back home to your wife?
Culturally.
Okay.
The police would have said, go back home to your wife.
Gotcha. So all we did was give the government more power because we refused to take on the responsibility ourselves. Because that was already illegal. You didn't need to write a new law to outlaw something that's already against the law.
Well, I agree in this sense. We took a roundabout way to address a problem we should have addressed more succinctly, which was the lack of action on the police side, culturally from the police.
Okay, so we didn't fix that by adding another law to the books.
Well, we began the process of fixing it, but we didn't complement it with the necessary work that follows.
Agreed, because I don't see how legislation can change culture.
Legislation in itself can't change culture, but you can use legislation to reinforce your efforts to shift culture. So
I have a problem with that. I have a huge problem with that. Because first of all, it demands you believe that the populace are too dumb to figure out something that should be self-evident on their own.
Well,
This is what I'm saying. If
They're-
me punching you in the face is already on the books, why does us being married now have an extra law? So there's two laws that basically say the same thing.
well, okay, the law was created because we realized that the cultural beliefs outweighed the belief in the rule of law and the law.
So we took a roundabout way. We didn't trust the people to change the culture.
Well, and I don't think a part of it is we didn't trust the people to change the culture. We have never engaged with sufficient energy. We've never really put in the effort to shift culture. I don't think there's been any social exercise, any social justice movement that is committed to the work of shifting culture. So when we look at
I have a problem with that term,
when
just
we-
parenthetically, social justice.
when we
But
look
we
at
can
the gender equality
circle back.
referendum, right? The government announced they were going to engage in this exercise and announced the exercise in 2013.
Another futile exercise in my mind, but
Right.
okay.
Delayed the process until practically the last minute in 2016. The government did not engage seriously or substantively. They did not commit certainly enough time to educational and awareness raising activities,
In your opinion.
in my opinion. Particularly with the attitude that they took, that if you don't agree with us, you're just stupid. I mean, that's essentially the attitude they took. If you don't agree with us on these legislative changes and cultural and social changes, then you're just stupid. That was offensive.
But that is
and-
often the viewpoint of government when a policy they've introduced is rejected by the people.
Well,
So that should be expected.
Well, we have examples of, I don't want to say more sophisticated countries, but we have examples of countries that approach the exercise differently, right? See, first of all, a referendum is supposed to rise up from the people. A referendum is supposed to be about issues that the people, the citizens, have agitated about and have come to the government and said, we think this needs to change.
You're jumping around here. We're talking about a bunch of different things all at once.
Well, no, we're talking about the same thing. So we're talking about cultural shifts. And we're talking about...
Okay, so
and we're talking
can't talk about a cultural shift and say the way to that is by having a referendum.
No. What I'm saying is that a referendum should rise up from the people. This referendum...
As a part of the cultural shift.
Right, as a part of a cultural shift.
Shifting, and as a result of that, let's bring these laws...
Right, then
okay.
As a part of a cultural shift, the majority of your people will rise up and say, boss, we think differently about this
Literally,
issue now.
rise up and say, boss.
Yeah, boss, that's how we do it. We think differently about this issue now, and we think it's time for the Constitution to change to reflect the difference in cultural attitudes, right? That's how a referendum should work. When a government decides that it's going to have a referendum on an issue, it needs to take I think it takes at least 5 years to engage in social awareness, education campaigns, to introduce the idea that you think is good as a government to your people, right? Now, here's where the issue...
I'm not cutting you off intentionally, but I have to stop there. Just pause for just a moment. Because, first of all, can we agree that governments will never do that for the main reason that when they introduce a referendum, they already have the outcome in mind?
Oh yeah, and we could agree that that the type of government that we have ain't on the run that I think we should be on, right? But here's why this is important. So we had this referendum. The Constitutional Reform Committee said to us, well, listen, considering the contributions that we've gotten from the people, we think gender is the issue, the first issue we should run with, right?
Mm-hmm.
The response from the Bahamian people is, what are y'all talking about? We don't know what gender means, and we already think men and women are equal, so we don't know why you're trying to do this right now.
Indeed. So why are we trying to do this right now?
Here's what's interesting about
if we already think
the government. From 1991 to 2010.
I like how you did that, by the way. The government.
Right.
Not the government, just,
government.
whatever the hell that means.
Right? From 1991 to 2010, we've actually had a very progressive legislative agenda in relation to gender and gender relations, right?